Hello. Have you done anything a bit daft recently? I know during lockdown quite a few people are doing sort of slightly crazy things and maybe post them on social media. But actually we do daft things all the time. You know, maybe we're wandering around saying, where did I put my phone? Where did I put my phone? And then we notice that it's in our hand the whole time. Or maybe you're searching for your keys in your pocket and you suddenly go out the front door and realise you've left your keys in the door. Or this is one of my favourite things, is that you're cooking something, preparing something for dinner, and you get whatever it is out of the fridge, and it's got instructions on about how long you need to cook it for and under at what level and so on. And you say, right, I've got that, and you put the package in the bin, and then you start cooking, and then all of a sudden you think, oh, I've forgotten the instructions, so you don't have to get it out of the bin. People do daft things, crazy things all the time and in different situations. One of my favourite recent stories is about the president of Ukraine. He's a chap called Zelensky, and he was recently elected as president of Ukraine, but he had no political experience at all. His experience was an actor, and he was acting in a TV show where he was playing the role of a teacher who gets elected as president with no political experience whatsoever. And then in real life, that's what happens to him. Really daft things happen all around the world in all different places. And our reading today is about the supremely daft, foolish thing. Paul tells us that God's wisdom looks foolish to the world. And in particular, the wisdom of God in sending Jesus to live life with us, amongst us, to die for us and rise again for us. Paul says, look, there may be all sorts of daft things that have happened in history, but this is the daftest of all. The creator of the universe, the invisible God who's supreme above all things, has come to the earth in the person of Jesus. He's taken human form, and he hasn't just done that. He's then come as a servant, and he's given up his life. The people around him, through whom they were created, through him, he's allowed them to actually take his life and to nail it to the cross and to kill him and to extinguish his life as a demonstration of his love for us. That is, by human standards, absolutely crazy. It makes no sense at all. We might not realise the paradox here, and it reaches its climax where Paul says in chapter 2 of our reading, I resolve to know nothing amongst you but Christ crucified. And it's easy for us to forget what a paradox, what nonsense that must have sounded like to so many people. The word Christ means God's anointed Messiah, the one who was to come with his power and was to enact his rule on earth. But crucifixion was a demeaning punishment that was doled out to rebels and slaves and good-for-nothings, and usually their body was then abandoned in a common ditch. Christ crucified. It sums up the paradox, the foolishness, the craziness of God's plan and the way that he showed how much he loves us. But I think we often forget this paradox. We forget how crazy this is, this scheme of God's. And we do it for two reasons. One is internal to our life as a church, that we hear this story so often, we become familiar with it, and that's a good thing, but it may mean that we forget, we don't realise what an extraordinary and crazy and foolish thing it sounds when you first hear it. The God of heaven has come down and taken the form of a servant and poured out his life for us, his creatures. We have to just stand back and realise what an extraordinary thing that is. But there's a second reason why we might forget how shocking that is, and that's something outside of the church. It's to do with our common life, and it's highlighted by a chap called Tom Holland, who wrote this enormous book called Dominion, really looking at the influence of the Christian faith on Western culture. And he says it's a little bit like fish who swim in a bowl. They're the last ones to recognise the water that they swim in. He says Western life, Western culture, Western values, for example, our belief that all lives matter, actually these aren't random, these aren't rational beliefs, these are actually deeply rooted in the Christian story. We swim in, as it were, Christian waters in our culture without even realising it. There's no logical reason why we should look at another human being and say they have equal value with us. And in fact, there's lots of reasons not to think that. The only reason that we believe in the value of every human life, says Tom Holland, is because of the Christian faith. He was a historian. He still says he's not a Christian, but as a historian, he was studying the life of ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and he realized with a shock, even though he wasn't a believer, he says, these are not my values. These are not the things I believe in, these values from the ancient world. Something changed them, and he realized that it was Christian faith. He realized it was the belief that Christ was crucified for us, which changed everything. And it's remarkable that Paul, near the beginning of this letter to the Christians in Corinth, within the Roman Empire, starts with this as the bedrock of what he wants to say. One commentator on this passage called Richard Hayes says this about it: our familiarity with the cross as a theme of Christian preaching may tend to obscure the astonishing imaginative power of this passage. Paul has taken the central event at the heart of the Christian story, the death of Jesus, and he's used it as a lens through which all human experience must be projected and thus seen afresh. The cross becomes a starting point for a revolution in our thinking. Well, what kind of revolution is that, and how does it affect the way we see the world? Well, I think Paul says essentially three things. Now, since my last sermon, I've been kind of working on the 3 points all beginning with the same letter. So my 3 points are: it affects our thinking, it affects our fellowship, and it affects our fanfare. And again, if you've got a better 3 headings, then do send them to me. I did get a few suggestions after the last time. Okay, so it affects our thinking. It affects our thinking. Paul says this near the beginning of our passage. He's quoting from the Old Testament, from the book of Isaiah. I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the intelligence of the intelligent I will frustrate. And then he kind of taunts his imagined listener who's trusted in philosophers and maybe studied ancient wisdom, and he says this: where are the wise? Where is the teacher of the law? So he's looking at both Greek and Jewish intelligent people. Where is the philosopher of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? Now, we need to be careful to see what Paul is saying here. He isn't actually saying there's no value in academic study. I hope that's reassuring for those of you who are studying for a degree or reading books, or he isn't saying there's no value in listening and learning from other people. But look what he contrasts. He contrasts the wisdom which is human wisdom, and he contrasts that with the wisdom of the cross, the apparent folly of what God has done, which is God's wisdom. And it's not so much the content or the method. He's saying, look, where does this wisdom come from, and where does it go to? There is a way of thinking which says, look, it makes sense, for example, that the wealthy and the clever should rule us, for example, in government. They should make the decisions. Well, after all, surely if they are smart and if they are well off, they've obviously got some answers to the questions of life. So surely we should benefit from their wisdom. There's a kind of logic to say, you know, as we lift the lockdown, what we really need to do is we need to open the shops for trading all day on a Sunday. After all, you know, people are going to suffer because of the economic downturn as a result of the situation that we're in, and we need to get the economy moving. We've got to have money to pay for the NHS, so we want to stimulate the economy. Let's open all the shops for a whole day Sunday trading. But, you know, going to church isn't essential, so we'll keep the church buildings closed. There's a certain logic which says the strong should rule the weak. The successful should actually take charge of those who are less successful. There's a certain human logic. But what Paul is saying is that when we start thinking in these ways, these things are based on human assumptions, and they serve human needs, and they rule God out of it. All sorts of statues have been toppled this week, and I wonder when Charles Darwin is going to be the next statue that's toppled. After all, when he was thinking about evolution of different species, although he celebrated the end of slavery when it came about, the logic of what he said, he noticed, was to say, well, in the end, the stronger human cultures are going to eliminate the weaker ones, because that is how evolution works. Well, says Paul, that's how your thinking goes when you simply follow human wisdom and you rule out the values and the wisdom of God. Whenever we're engaging with these big issues around us in society, whenever we're thinking about our own personal issues and how we conduct our lives, it makes sense, for example, if we've been wounded in the past, to protect ourselves, to close ourselves down and to hold ourselves back from relationships with others. Whenever we think about either the personal or the political, Paul says, if we exclude God's perspective, if we exclude this central truth, that actually God emptied himself and gave himself to us in the person of Jesus, then our thinking is going to go wrong. So that's the first area where the death of Jesus, the Christ crucified, as central to our beliefs, will revolutionize some of the ways that we live our lives. But here's the second thing. First of all, thinking. Secondly, fellowship. Halfway through our reading, Paul says something, which might have been taken a little bit insulting. I don't know if you noticed it. He says this to the Christians in Corinth. Brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards, not many influential, not many were of noble birth. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. I wonder how that went down when it was read out to the Christians in Corinth. They might have felt a little bit put out, a little bit insulted. Now, I'm not standing in front of you, so I can't say it to your faces, but I can imagine you sitting there, wherever you are at home, listening to this, and I say to you, well, look at you lot. You're not very impressive, are you? You're a bit of a motley crew. Well, I know some of you are smart, but some of you aren't really. Some of you are doing well, some of you are struggling a bit, but the fact that you lot are a mixed bunch and a little bit foolish just goes to show how great God is. I'm not sure how that would go down. I'm not sure how it's going down with you right now. But actually, as we reconnect with one another, as we look around, we can say, yeah, we are a bit of a motley bunch, actually. We are a bit of a mixed bag. We're different in terms of our background. We're different in terms of our education. We're different from one another in terms of the kind of things we do, our occupations, whether we're in work or whether we're unemployed, whether we're at home, whether this time has been one of busyness or boredom. And we're of different ethnic backgrounds and language backgrounds. Some of us come from this region, some from London, some from Scotland, some from other parts of the world, some from Asia, some from Iran, some from South America, some from Germany, all sorts. And that is a sign of God's grace. You see, if God had called and chosen us to know him in Jesus because we were a particular nationality, because our skin had a particular colour, because we spoke a particular language or had a particular job, then in the end that comes down to who we are and not who God is. But the fact that God made all humanity in his image, the fact that the grace of God flowed over in Jesus outside the boundaries of one ethnic group, the Jews, Israel, but actually flowed to all peoples, that shows his grace. There's a critical point in the story in Acts that Luke tells us about the early church, Acts 10 verse 34, where Peter, having met with Cornelius and the Spirit being poured out on this Gentile soldier, he says, "Now I know God shows no favoritism, but his grace is available to every nation." And the word he uses there, every nation, every ethnos, it's where we get our word ethnicity from. And actually you find this theme through every part of the New Testament. Paul says in Romans 2, he says, God shows no favoritism. In James, he says that we should not show favoritism to anyone because God doesn't. Peter says in his first letter, we trust in one who judges impartially without showing favoritism. This is the vision of God's grace. Because it doesn't depend on us, it must include everybody from every background who comes to faith, to trust in Jesus, and who receives the Spirit so that we might be shaped in conformity to live holy lives, even though we come from very different backgrounds. We believe the one thing. There's one baptism, Paul says, there's one faith, there's one Lord. From our different backgrounds and our different views and our different understandings, from our diversity, we come together in a unity of faith. And of course, the book of Revelation expresses that more clearly than any other. It says that those who stand before the throne, they've washed their clothes in the blood of the Lamb, washed them white, they've come through suffering, and they praise the God and the Lamb before the throne day and night. That's us. And they come from every tribe, language, people, and nation, all across the earth, not eliminating our differences, but drawing us together into a common faith. That's the wisdom of God. And in case we haven't spotted it, the book of Revelation repeats that 7 times, just to make sure that we get the point. So the centrality of Christ crucified, it changes our thinking, it changes our fellowship. The church in our culture is the one place where people of every age and every background actually meet together in relationship. It doesn't really happen like that anywhere else in our culture. And the third thing is our fanfare, the message that we have. Paul says that our message is foolishness to those who are perishing, who don't receive it, but it's God's wisdom to those who are being saved. And he goes on to say that, well, having actually come from Athens, further north, where he tried to engage with the culture, he tried to make the Christian faith sound plausible by quoting poets from the culture and by trying to connect the faith with the thinking of the period. Now when he's come to Corinth, he says, do you know what? I resolved to know nothing amongst you except Christ crucified. I came to you in weakness and great fear and trembling. That's the exact opposite of what people would expect orators to do in his day. They'd expect that someone with an important message, they'd have practiced it, they'd have rehearsed it, they'd have polished it, they'd come with great confidence and panache and speak boldly and sound really good. And Paul says, I did none of that. I did none of that when I was with you. My message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words, although Paul does know how to use wise and persuasive words. He's an incredible orator, and he often writes in a very sophisticated way, which is perhaps sometimes why we struggle a little bit to get our heads around the things he's saying. But he says the core of it is, I've come with the wisdom and the power of God. And that means that when we come to share, when we come to blow out the fanfare, to share with others the good news of what God has done for us in Jesus. Do you know what? We shouldn't be surprised if some people just say to us, well, that just sounds daft to me. That's nonsense. That doesn't make any sense. And put up all sorts of objections and questions and don't want to hear. Now, there's an important place for explaining faith. There's an important place for making the case, for apologetics, for overcoming objections. We need to be doing that as well. But we also need to recognise that, if we're going to share faith with those around us, then sometimes we're just going to look a bit daft, and that's par for the course. That was true for Paul, and it was true for Paul. It's going to be true for us as well. At the beginning, I mentioned the historian Tom Holland and his book Dominion about how Christian faith has shaped Western culture. One of the striking things in a recent interview is he talks about going to Iraq and going to the place where this group called the Yazidis had been persecuted and had been killed by Islamic State. And he gives a very moving account of how shocking and how disturbing he found it, because the terrorists from Islamic State had actually crucified some of the Yazidi men. And he says this: for the first time, I was facing the reality of crucifixion as it had been practiced by the Romans, face to face. It was physical in the air. It was very hot. There was the smell of dust and of bodies and of heat. I'm not a brave person, he said. I felt very scared to be there. I felt intimidated by it. At the same time, I experienced it as blasphemy. I felt as though it was a blasphemy that anyone could crucify people, quite apart from any reference to the Christian story at all. And then he goes on, I realised how important it was to me to believe that in some way, someone being tortured on a cross illustrated the truth of the possibility that power might be vanquished by powerlessness, and that the weak might vanquish the strong, and that death and hope might be found in the teeth of life, in despair. That, says Paul, is the wisdom of God. A friend of mine, Adrian Chatfield, some of you may know. Adrian is white, but he was brought up as a white minority in Trinidad and Tobago, and he's had some very profound reflections to share around all the questions that have come up about racism and the death of George Floyd. And he connects that to what God has done for us in Jesus, the foolishness of Jesus dying for us on a cross. And he says this: there's something here, that is in Jesus coming to us, that about God choosing to value the human race, indeed the cosmos, even when our scarred and corrupt nature and actions suggest otherwise. The act of incarnation is many things: a celebration of the divine, of physicality of the creation, a participation in that creation, and a commitment to transformation. At the heart of it is the astonishing self-emptying of Christ, a bending lower than the low, that the low might be exalted. If at the heart of God there is an impulse to bend down, to reach those whom God might easily dismiss, this teaches me that if I share in the love of God, my ultimate call is bending low too. May God give us the grace to hear this astonishing story and to allow it to shape our thinking, our fellowship, and our fanfare, the way we express God's love to others as we too bend low as he did for us.